There we go. Now, this will be available on our YouTube channel and on our website. And finally, if you guys have any questions for our speakers, feel free to include those questions in the chat, and we'll have a little time at the end to answer some of those. So without further ado, Jim and Paul, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Joe. And Paul, I'm so glad that you're here. You've been working with Preservation Massachusetts as our legislative agent since 2002 and done a great job. What we'd like to try to accomplish here today is we want to create a coalition of people who would be willing to lobby their local and state reps and senators. And that's in an effort to promote the Massachusetts State Historic Tax Credit. And the feeling there is that you as individuals may know your legislators, your constituents of your legislators, and you have the ability to perhaps accomplish more than some of us who are just trying to lobby the State Historic Tax Credit. So the effort would be to potentially increase credit from a cap of $55 million by an additional $10 million next year in 2023. That's what we're thinking. That could perhaps change, but we need to have an ask and we need to have a goal. So I think, that's where we're beginning, and we're trying to get out in front of this. In late 2022, we yet haven't had general elections yet, but they're going to soon be happening. So I also wanted to give just a little bit of background to the history of the State Historic Tax Credit. Preservation Massachusetts and the Massachusetts Preservation Coalition conceived of the tax credit back in 2002. And we saw it as the best way to restore historic commercial properties in Massachusetts. It was that simple. And our Massachusetts Preservation Coalition all agreed with that and really jumped in to really work on developing legislation to that goal. So through the years, we've lobbied the state legislature to increase the credit from a beginning of $10 million in 2002 to our current number of $55 million in 2022. We haven't had great success in increasing the credit in the past several years, but we know it's important. We know, as Preservation Massachusetts knows, that they know all the projects that are looking for funding. Letters of support have to be written by Preservation Massachusetts. And we know full well that there are many, many projects that are not getting funded, and these projects aren't getting done. And clearly, the developers who have used the credit here in Massachusetts have said over and over again, without the state and federal historic tax credits, these projects wouldn't happen at all. So I'm going to leave it at that point. Well, I was also going to say, Joe and I have talked about at some point down the road, putting a script together that would be available so that if you're talking to one of your legislators or several of your legislators, you would know kind of what the ask is and what we're looking for, and you would hopefully feel more comfortable having that information. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I'm going to turn over to Paul for a bit.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks, Joe, and good afternoon to everybody. As Jim mentioned, I've been working with Preservation Mass now for a good 20 years, since the inception and the idea of presenting a state law and an appropriation to create the Mass Historic Tax Credit. Some of you know that this tax credit, coupled with a federal tax credit, has been historically now for the last 20 years a real powerful tool, not only in preserving such historic treasures, but also being such a driver of economic development in many of your communities. I think more generally, I'd like to tell you, ask you specifically, tell you, why is this important? Needless to say that, government at all levels, local, state, and federal, not only affect you individually, but affect your organizations. There's just no way of not having some interaction with government in some fashion specifically. So it's important to understand in that universe who makes the decisions that affect you individually and who affects your agencies statewide. Joe mentioned it, but I want to repeat. The price of admission in this is just, first and foremost, you need to be registered to vote. With that, you have a voice in this process. Without that, you're politely dismissed by elected officials as being unimportant because you don't affect them. And obviously, affecting them is what this whole process is about, positively or negatively, quite frankly. But in this case, it's more a positive development to elected officials than it is a negative. I think Jim also mentioned broadly, you need to know your elected officials at all levels, both at the federal level, the state level, and at the federal level. Some of you come from cities. If they're from strong mayors, form of government, it's important to know who he or she is. At the state level, it's important, particularly as it affects this credit, your state legislator, state rep, and your state senator. All of you have one member or maybe one House member and one state Senate member. And it's also important to know your congressperson. There's only 10 of them in Massachusetts, and we all have one. So it's important to know who that person is. And moreover, in this universe of elected officials is just as important as the elected officials are members of their staffs, which more than likely is the first contact you would have in trying to interact with your elected officials. What we do basically is provide information and education to elected officials. In the case of the tax credit, it's a pretty simple, straightforward message. The credit has produced millions, if not billions of dollars of economic development and statewide, and it has also affected individual communities with economic development. It has provided jobs, and it has provided a tax base for commercial sites that have not been utilized. So it's a powerful argument, and it is our process, our goal is to continue to educate legislators on the state tax credit and local officials who can be allies of yours in lobbying state legislators, a really important piece of that, to increase the credit, if not make the credit permanent going forward. So just to summarize that, be registered to vote, know who your local and state elected officials are, and your federal elected official. Get the information that you need to provide it to your local officials and to your state legislators. And don't assume that they know anything you're talking about. Quite frankly, they deal with hundreds of issues on a day-to-day basis. So you may be assuming that people know what you're talking about. Don't assume it at all. So you're in the position to educate legislators as to why this credit is important, why it needs to be either permanent or why it needs to be expanded, and what benefit it has created for your agencies or for your communities. So that, in a nutshell, is summarizing where we like to build this coalition. Jim mentioned the coalition. A coalition is simply a group of like-minded people who have a like-minded interest. And in this case, we assume all of you know about the state tax credit. All of you know the importance of it and what it's done in your communities, and that we share sort of a special interest in continuing to promote the growth of this credit. So I'm going to stop there, Joe. I always think it's better to get an interaction with people in terms of Q&A than boring them with a lecture. So
Paul, before you turn it over, let me, you and I are playing off one another a little bit here. And I have to remind everyone that Paul Pezzella has been a legislative agent for most of his career. And he's on Beacon Hill. And he's the one who tells us at Preservation Massachusetts and others who want to be involved in lobbying efforts, what we need to do, who we need to talk to, who are the key individuals, key legislators. But I think, again, what we're attempting to do for this upcoming year is, we've said coalition 100 times, and we'll say it again, is to get like-minded individuals, as Paul said, involved in working with their own local legislators, their own elected officials. And it's hugely important, and they listen to you. And Paul had mentioned a little bit about the impact of what the credit is. I just want to share a couple of numbers that may be helpful. Through 2020, over $884 million in credits have been awarded. They have assisted in creating over 17,000 housing units, over 10,000 deemed affordable, 40,000 temporary jobs, 15,000 permanent jobs. So clearly, the state historic tax credit is a major piece of what historic preservation and what it does to the economy. You know, we could talk on another day about CPA and what that does, but we want to talk today about the lobby efforts for the state and federal historic credit.
Just to add to what Jim's saying, I assume, and maybe I shouldn't assume, that we all know that the credit, as all historic preservation issues, are managed by the Secretary of State, in this case, Bill Galvin. And through his office, Bronner Simon and the Mass Historical Commission, they're responsible essentially for evaluating individual projects and deeming them worthy of a credit or a portion of the credit. So although this is a legislative exercise to reward the credit by continuing to support it, essentially is managed by the Secretary of State. And specifically, I don't know if Jim mentioned this, but as it stands now through 2022, there is $50 million available for projects that qualify for the historic tax credit. They are usually allocated through 4 rounds that the Secretary of State awards these credits to individual developers. So there's not enough, because we've seen that demand is greater than the supply, but certainly $50 million has brought us a lot of restoration and saving historic buildings, and also has provided, as Jim said, an enormous boost to economic development, jobs, and property tax increases.
So you want to, Joe, do you want to turn it over for some questions at this point, or you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Delve deeper into this.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both for giving that wonderful overview of the tax credit program, as well as our general wishes for, how to lobby and advocate our elected officials for preservation issues. I'd like to add too, and I think, Jim and Paul both sort of mentioned this as well, that with the historic tax credit program and all of the preservation initiatives that we lobby and advocate our elected officials for, nothing is set in stone. And these are issues that we continue going back to Beacon Hill, to Washington, D.C. to advocate for. And that's why your help is so important. We can lobby all day about these issues, and we have. But you as constituents and as informed citizens will really help inform and influence your elected official to help them understand the needs of preservation in their community. Now, as I said, feel free, if you have questions, to put those in the chat. I've got a few that we can start with. Now,
Joe, can I jump in one more thing? I think as we're talking, something else comes up. But I think it's also important for everyone who's on the call and for people who are going to watch this on Preservation Mass website, is that first and foremost, you should not be intimidated by any of your elected officials. When you have something you want to say to your rep or senator or your congressman, you can do that. You can say that, whether it starts with a staff member or whatever it happens to be, as long as you know what it is what your goal is, and what your ask is, and what you want to accomplish. And it's been a concern and an issue of all of ours that individuals just are uncomfortable doing this kind of thing, and they shouldn't be, because elected officials know that constituents are going to be asking questions or asking for something, and they in turn are going to want your support. So it's, the door swings both ways. So I'll stop at that point.
Jim, that's an excellent point. And I would point out too that, from what we've seen from our own legislative body and from what we've heard from other states, historic preservation is by and large, it's a nonpartisan issue. It's popular on both sides of the aisle. So the task for us is it's not a lot of heavy lifting on your part, but the idea is just sharing examples from your own community about how historic preservation has helped in your community and how continued legislation and funding will continue to help in your communities. Now, as we wait for more questions to join in, Jim, I kind of want to jump back onto something that you had said earlier, which is, not being intimidated by your elected official when you try to communicate to them about historic preservation issues. And I think everyone on this call has in some way advocated for historic preservation before, whether it's talking to community members or appealing through grant processes or other pieces of written information. So my question to both you, Jim, and to Paul is, do you find speaking to elected officials similar? Is it a similar advocacy process? Do you use the same language as you would talking to members of the public or other historic preservation professionals?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. So, well, I mean, again, legislators are, citizens of an individual community. So there's no magic of government speak that you need to communicate to members of the legislature or to your local government and to staff. I think that if you have an item, an issue, you are in control of what you're providing for information. So providing that information and explaining it and explaining what you're asking of a legislator is pretty much elementary in terms of how you pursue a member. So there's no special language or anything. I would say, and I saw one of the questions pop up about how to talk to a legislator, how to approach, how to lobby an issue. A lot of it comes with frequency. By that I mean, if you run an agency in a city, well, primarily in a city, I'd like to get a sense of where people are coming from. But it's frequency that's going to make a difference. So, for instance, inviting a legislator, a House member or a Senate member to come and visit your agency and to get a briefing is a good way to begin a relationship. And these relationships are relationships that you build on. So it's not a one-shot issue. It's not one phone call or one letter. It's a process. And the more that you get familiar with what legislators, what makes them tick, in terms of an issue, the better you are going to be educated yourself as to how to advocate with them. So opening your agency to a meet and greet with your staff or individually, or to go over the priorities of your agency with your state rep or your state senator, or even their staff people, because more than likely that's what you'll get initially, right, is a way to beginning a process. And then you don't stop there. You continuously inform that legislator what's going on with your agency, how you're affecting the community, how you're affecting their districts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I also want to say, you have allies that might not affect you directly at the local level, but a mayor, if you're in a city, if you have a relationship with, could also be an advocate for things that you care about. If it's important to the community, and there's no better on the ground experience than a mayor who runs a city, because he or she knows what's going on all over the place. If they feel a relationship with you and they feel that your issues are important to the city, you can contact them and ask them to advocate for your issue with the legislature. So at the local level, building relationships with a city manager or a strong mayor and their staffs is equally as important as having the direct relationship with the state legislature.
That's a great answer, Paul. And again, just to add on a little bit, Preservation Massachusetts also goes down to Washington, D.C. and lobbies our members of Congress. Paul had mentioned the 10 members of Congress, or 9 members of Congress, and two United States senators.
Right.
And we go down there, and we spend a couple of days on Capitol Hill. It's interesting, it's exciting. We have over the years, grown to know these congressional members. They kind of expect us every year about the same time. We go in, having an idea of what it is we're trying to accomplish, and your time is short with them. It maybe not as short as Beacon Hill, but on average you get about 20 minutes, maybe 25 minutes. And if you can, if you get to know that member of Congress, that member of Congress will meet with you. But if not, you end up with a staff person, and their staffs are great. I mean, they have very, very intelligent people, and your message will rise up to the member of Congress. So again, you don't be intimidated. It's interesting, and it can be fun, right, Paul?
Yes, I mean, it's always adrenaline going. You have an issue you care about, you get excited about it. You're in front of a legislator or their staff, constantly telling them what this particular issue is or this credit does, and
right.
Being a strong advocate. And people can tell if you're sincere. I mean, if you're just going through the motions, they'll say, he doesn't really care, she doesn't really care. So having some passion and some dedication to the issue that you're representing makes a big difference, because again, going back to what was said earlier about what makes up a legislator is they'll feel passion, they'll see dedication, and that motivates a legislator who say, shit, they really care about this. It motivates them to do something. So if you don't show the same kind of enthusiasm for the issue, they're going to pick that up in body language and say, well, it was nice meeting with you, and not do anything with the issue that you presented.
Yeah, another good point, Paul. That's great.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jim, I think your point too of, being meaningful, being impactful, but being concise with your language as well. You will have a short amount of time, to speak with them, whether it's in person or over the phone or in Zoom. So making sure you understand the issue at hand and being able to effectively communicate your ask, as we might call it, right, is extremely important. And that will help you be an effective advocate for them for these preservation issues.
Right, right.
Now,
we spent most of our time talking about the state tax credit and not so much the federal credit. But we work out on the federal credit as well, and that's more of a national issue or national mobilization. But we also know what the preservation organizations in Washington are looking to accomplish, and they provide us with that. So we know what we need to do, and we can provide that same information to you as well.
That's exactly what I was about to say.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, you're taking the words right out of my mouth, which is perfect. See how in sync we are, ladies and gentlemen. But what I was going to say is that, yeah, Preservation Massachusetts, as one of our education and advocacy tools, has created a fact sheet about the state historic tax credit, and that if it's not available on our website yet, it will be available for our users to look at, so they too can have the facts that Jim was talking about earlier about the number of projects that have been allocated funds and where these projects are located. Now, another question I had for the two of you is, in our last preservation conversation, we talked about the importance of storytelling in preservation. And the takeaway for a number of our guest speakers there was the idea of changing the language of preservation and making it interesting for the listeners, which I think is something that we could probably take away and do with our legislators as well. So how do you take the raw data and the raw numbers from the tax credit legislation or from the Community Preservation Act, and how do you change the narrative about the value and importance of historic preservation in our neighborhoods?
Good question. Paul, you want to jump on?
I didn't get the whole question, Joe. Try rephrase it for me. I'm sorry.
Sure. So how do you import the importance and impact of preservation for communities? How do you make that
Well,
point?
good question is by showing it. There's nothing more powerful than showing the result, the success of a development that has had the funding from either the federal or state tax credit or both. So I said to, I think, all of you earlier, I mean, inviting people to your agency to sort of go through a meet and greet to get people on your staffs or individually to know who your legislator is also an opportunity for you to present those projects, in this case on the credit, that have been successful, particularly if it's in their city or their districts. So it's the visual and the information around the visual that make an impact more than anything else.
Right. Yeah, that's right, Paul. And I think, again, to add to that a little bit, one of the questions that we ask, particularly in Washington, D.C., if it's with a staff person, we ask them if they know why we're there. Why we're here to talk about, in this case, the federal historic tax credit. Do you know what that is? And it works in a way that many of the staff who work in Congress are very well versed in. They know taxes. So oftentimes they'll know what the federal historic tax credit is, but we generally will take some time to explain that a little bit. And I think to even easier, most of the legislators on Beacon Hill and the members of Congress are not, their top priority generally is not historic preservation. So, I think, and Paul, you always have those first few minutes where you just have kind of a nice conversation and you kind of calm things down and you kind of talk about, things that are going on, and then maybe get into your conversation, about what it is you're doing and why the historic preservation piece is so important. That can be more difficult with some legislators and less so with others. But,
yeah, I just, in terms of explaining the composition of the legislature, which I think is important, and this is true also of the federal government, not so much at the local level, but at the state legislative level, you have the House of Representatives with 140 members and the state Senate with 40 members. In the House of Representatives, obviously the House is managed, if not controlled, by the Speaker of the House. And the Speaker of the House in Massachusetts, as the Senate President, who is the person who is responsible for managing the Senate, have a great degree of power in terms of setting the agenda on all issues. So the individual legislator, depending on his or her seniority and whether in fact their leadership meaning that they're a committee chair or just a freshman, matters. So if you come from a community where you have someone from the leadership that represents you, he or she is going to have much more input with the Speaker and the Speaker's staff, and also with the Senate President and the Senate President's staff. So it's important to understand where your legislator resides in this power structure. And it is a top-down process. The Speaker and the Senate President, the chairs of House Ways and Means and Senate Ways and Means, have an enormous amount of power in terms of dictating and setting policy and also setting appropriations priorities. So it's important to understand that your own individual legislator can only take something so far unless he or she believes it's so important that they want to continue to advocate for this issue with the leaders that I mentioned.
Yeah, that's good, Paul. Joe, another really basic point that we haven't raised yet is how do you know who your legislators are? How do you know who your legislator is? And you can find that information online. We've talked a little bit about that. It's not difficult to do, and there's contact information that's always available as well. And we'd even talked about putting that on our website, but I think it's easy to find on a website if you're interested. So.
See, one of the questions on the chat was how do you communicate? And there were three options, snail mail, email, and text. I wouldn't text. Every legislator has an email address, and they respond, particularly if you're a constituent. So you might not get a direct response, but you'll get a response saying what you should do if you send an email. And that's always needs to be followed up. So however you communicate, if you choose snail mail with a letterhead directly to a legislator, they might get it and they might respond to it, but they'll respond quicker to an email. And always leave your contact information on that email. Once you get a response, they'll tell you how best to pursue post email, how to communicate with them on the issue you're talking about.
Yeah, both very good points. I see we've got a question in the chat here. Is the expanded tax credit designed to encourage new home ownership of historic homes and to assist homeowners in maintaining and/or rehabilitating their historic houses?
Go ahead, Jim.
Go ahead.
No, I mean, unfortunately, the credit is not targeted to residential historic development.
Right, it's commercial.
It's commercial and commercial only.
Yeah, it's a commercial credit, but it's so much of how the credit is utilized in Massachusetts is for housing. A big percentage of it is for housing, and I think we said at the beginning that a minimum of 25% for affordable. And that number is much higher than 25%. They've never had to rein that in at all. So
I'd be interested if we went around the group to see, to introduce yourselves and tell me where you're from, what community, whether it's your agency or you individually. So, Joe, I don't know if you want to sort of manage this, but we could open it up to let us know where you're all from.
Yeah, if you're comfortable, you can mute and shout out your name, and if you work for an organization and where you're from, or if you'd rather, you could put it in the chat if you'd rather remain a little bit more conservative and anonymous here. But I'll leave that up to our attendees this afternoon.
Anybody want to start? How about you, Stacia?
Yeah, I actually live in Central Mass. I live in a small town, and
which one?
Wales, Mass.
Wales.
Do you know where Wales is?
I do. I think it's not too far from Warren and that area, right?
You got it. It's it's south of Brimfield and borders on Holland near Sturbridge, that area. I work as a circuit rider for Preservation Massachusetts in Central and Western Mass. So this is really helpful since my work involves talking with folks in my area, in my region, and your information is really valuable, and I'll certainly be pointing folks to this recorded conversation.
Great.
Nice to see you. Nice to see you.
Yeah, good to see you.
How about you, Dawn?
Yeah, I'm Don Likowitz, and I'm with the Needham Historical Commission.
Needham?
Needham.
Okay.
And I was looking at, I guess it's in Hartford. They have a historic homes rehabilitation tax credit. Do you think anything like that is possible in the future?
I'm sorry. Was he talking about residential?
Yeah, I think that would be very difficult, Don. Bringing the commercial credit as far as we have is in itself probably the more important aspect of it. I want to say that residential
Yeah.
isn't, but
Yeah,
in terms of large scale development and in terms of political support, you get much more support for commercial projects than you will from residential. By the way, in regard to that question, in terms of the power base, it's also important for you all to know who's behind these projects, such as the developers. I mean, the developers stand to make money off these projects, and they're also and should be involved in this sort of lobbying process. So learning who the developer is of a project doesn't hurt if you can engage them to sort of work with you to not only showcase what they're doing for the individual project that they're on, but also advocating for the increase in the historic tax credit. And one more issue that I wanted to get back to Don's question about residential. I think what's more important going forward, not only the expansion of the credit, but because the credit has been so successful, I think it's important to make it permanent. We created this credit, what we call a 5-year sunset, meaning that in the end of 5 years, the credit goes away. One of the things we've been able to do since 2002 or 2004 is we've extended this credit for 5 years going through 2027. Joe, Jim,
yeah.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, 2027.
2027. So it's been our work that's extended this credit 5 years, 5 years, 5 years, 5 years. But one of the things that I've asked Jim and Joe and Erin to look at is trying to make this credit a permanent part of state government.
Yeah, and I think we'll work with you on that, Paul. I think it's a good time to do that. Don, go back to the residential credit. Preservation Massachusetts many years ago, and I'm going to go back 10, maybe 12 years, really did look into the possibilities of a residential credit. We talked to people in Rhode Island and in Connecticut. It just got no traction here in Massachusetts, and there were a multitude of reasons why, apparently, but it was just something that we just kind of stopped working on. And we've just been, as Paul said before, we've been very focused on the state historic credit, which is really it's a commercial credit.
Don, do you know who your legislators are in Needham?
Yes, Denise Garlick.
Right. And you know who your senator is?
Actually, I'm not sure.
I'm not sure either because it's been redistricted a number of times.
Yeah.
It might be, and she's in a competitive race, Becca Rausch. I'm not sure. But to point out, do you know Denise at all?
I've met her once or twice.
Yeah, she's important. She's part of what I call part of the leadership. She's got an important chairmanship, which means that she's part of the speaker's team. So just as a FYI, getting to know her getting to know you and your agency would be a door opener in terms of advocating for the credit or any issues that might affect you in Needham.
Great, thanks.
So get to know her. I've known her well. I've known her for years. She's good people and a full-time legislator and takes her job very seriously. So I would really recommend that you follow up somehow and begin a relationship with her.
Great, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Hey, Walker Powell.
Hi, I'm Walker.
How is
I work for the town of Orange. I'm the assistant planner, and one of my jobs is to work with the Historical Commission. So I'm attending to see how Historical Commission could support this and how they can be more effective at like lobbying and, reaching out beyond our community.
Well, as a local official, as I said in my presentation, legislators will return your call a lot quicker than someone they don't know, especially if you have a title and you work for the town of Orange. I think in your case, Ian Goby is a state senator. I'm not sure, but I think so.
Yeah.
So if in fact Senator Goby is your senator, I assume if you don't know her, you get to know her. I don't know who the rep is up in Orange. It's been redistricted a number of times also. So
yeah, and I'm pretty new here, so I haven't got to know anybody yet, but I'm sure.
yeah, reach out and let them know who you are and what you do. And again, having a position in town government, they will respond to you.
Yeah.
Great.
And Walker,
Mhm.
Stacia Kaplanson is on the call, and she has been spending a lot of time in Orange. on
Yeah,
a number
we've
of projects. So
encountered each
hopefully-
other a
We've
couple
been-
times now.
Yeah, hopefully
Yeah,
you know
yeah.
her.
I know Walker. Walker's doing amazing
Okay.
things in Orange.
Okay,
So
good.
yeah,
Good.
yeah, no, a real asset to Orange. So
Thank
thanks,
you.
Walker, for being here.
Thank you.
How about you, Melita? No?
I think I see in the chat she had put that she was just, interested in, hearing more about this subject specifically.
about-
So thanks for joining us, Melita, for that.
How about Aaron? You with us, Aaron?
I am, but I am similar. I'm actually calling in from Minnesota because we work on many of the same issues, and I am planning on having an intern kind of develop an outline for doing this kind of training here in Minnesota. And I was just curious to see how you guys had done it. So it's great
Welcome.
information. It's always a good refresher for me too to remember some of those practical speaking points. So
Well, we talk to people in other states, and
Yeah.
oftentimes we do communicate. So, if at some point you wanted to get back to Preservation Massachusetts and have a more of a conversation, we're happy to do that. As a statewide preservation organization. So let us know.
Yeah, and I'm with the organization that used to be the Preservation Alliance of Minnesota. We
Okay.
changed our name to Rethos. So yeah, been around in the preservation sphere for a long time. But yeah, I agree that it's really valuable to be able to share perspectives, and that's why I lean on our national colleagues to help me remember some of the things that I need to help share with other folks. So
Well, I think it's
appreciate the info.
It's
Are you
nice
in the-
to have you.
you in the
Nice to
Twin
have you
Cities?
from Minnesota. Thanks.
Are you in the Twin Cities?
I am. Yep, I'm in St. Paul.
Okay. Nice community.
Yeah, so we had a very robust historic tax credit until June of this last year when our legislature didn't do their job and let it sunset.
Yeah,
So now we're
yeah.
gonna figure
Oh.
out how to scramble and get it back.
We follow that because, we see that on a national level. So we know how disappointing that was for you.
Yeah,
I'm
really.
sorry that happened.
Go back at it. Yeah.
Job
Yeah.
security for me, so I guess I'll keep working on it.
Well, again, if you can highlight your successes, not only in Minnesota, but to the group here in Massachusetts, it makes all the difference in the world. I don't know if there's any specific projects in Needham that you can point to or to in Orange, but in a county or in a region, a state Senate region or a state rep district, and I don't know the boundaries of your own legislative districts, but if you can become familiar with your individual districts, your state reps district and your state senators district, it doesn't have to come specifically from Needham or from Orange or from Air. It would have to be sort of shown from a regional standpoint too, because some of the small communities don't have many of these commercial projects that are turned into development projects. And by the way, one of the more critical issues in Massachusetts today is housing. That's all people are talking about, both in Boston and Washington and locally. There's just not enough housing. One of the aspects of this credit is that it has been a big driver of creating affordable housing throughout the state. So, you can be part of the housing discussion, particularly on the affordable side, not the market rate side, but maybe some communities can benefit from market, but affordable. This credit has created hundreds, if not thousands, of housing units across the state. So that's a very big, important talking point in this day and age.
Right, Paul?
Absolutely. Well, folks, we are running short on time here, and in an effort to get everybody out in a timely manner, we'll begin to wrap this up. Now, very briefly, I'd be remiss if I didn't share a few resources that Preservation Massachusetts has available on its website. So let me share my screen very briefly. I hope that you can all see this. So this is our legislative initiative page, which is available on Preservation Massachusetts website. It's under our advocacy tab here. And this is where we share information about all of the current legislative initiatives that we're currently working on or have worked on in the past. So you can see here we have some information here about the historic tax credits, about the Community Preservation Act, and other legislative issues either we're working on at Beacon Hill or in Washington, DC. So you could look there to see our progress and what we've been accomplishing throughout the year. Also on this page, we do have links here. So if you're curious to know who your House or Congress member is in Washington or on the state level, we do have links here available. So you can search using your community or your zip code to find that legislator, their website, and their information. And finally, I'd also like to point out, if you have other requests beyond the legislative scope for preservation, we do offer on our website our Action Center here, which does a breakdown of all of the resources we have for a variety of preservation issues, whether it's the tax credit, whether it's finding grant money or other resources in our statewide preservation community. So be sure to check out our website and find those websites and resources. Or if you have other questions for us, feel free to reach out, and we're always happy to assist you on whatever the preservation issue is.
Joe, I just wanted to mention one last thing is that, we're in the middle of an election cycle. So as you all know, the general election is what, November 7th, I think, or 6th, I'm not sure. Tuesday, first Tuesday in November, which means that there'll be a whole new legislature, both at the state level and also at the federal level. So it might be irrelevant right now, not knowing until after November, the election, who your legislator is. So a lot of incumbents are running unopposed for election, but there's a lot of new districts and a lot of new members. So I would just ask you that after the general election, you can get refreshed on who your individual member is by checking who got elected and who is your rep, senator, and Congress people. And lastly, the new legislative session, which is a 2-year session, begins in January. So in January, bills are filed, those go to committee, budgets are starting to be worked on. And from January to at least April, that's when you see a lot of action from the governor to the House to the Senate, and the budget process goes through May. So I just wanted to point out that calendar.
Yeah, that's good, Paul.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thanks again to our speakers, Paul Pezzella, Jim Igoe, and thank you to everyone who attended today and offered a few words for us. We do appreciate it. And as always, follow us on social media and on our website for updates about upcoming preservation conversations and resources for historic preservation. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely afternoon.
Joe, thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.